Ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, a very, very warm welcome to this Thursday of our Hist250 week. So those of you who are joining us for the first time in our celebrations, I'll provide a brief context to what we are in fact celebrating. So the Hist is a student society and was founded 250 years ago to promote discourse and to discuss key issues with students on campus, so specifically within Trinity College. And over the course of the week, what we've done is slowly expand our focus. So on Monday, we were discussing issues in relation to our universities, in relation to university education. On Tuesday, we looked at British-Irish relations and problems with the common law post-Brexit. Wednesday, then, we continued to widen our focus to look at the institutions of the European Union and the policies of that bloc. And today, I think we are looking at probably the most pressing and all-encompassing issues that face our society, those of climate solidarity, of climate crisis, and of capitalism. So for both panels this evening, they will be chaired by a dear friend of the Hist, Senator Ivana Bacik, who I will now introduce, but she has been a long-standing friend of the Society and was made a Vice President of the Hist too. Senator Bacik is the Reed Professor of Criminal Law, Criminology and Penology of Trinity College, Dublin. This post was previously held by another one of our distinguished speakers this evening, Mary Robinson. Senator Bacik is a qualified barrister and a senior lecturer and a fellow of the college. She is a senator for Dublin University, elected in 2007, re-elected then twice in 2011 and 2016. Her research interests include criminal law, criminology, feminist theory of law and equality law. She co-authored a major study on gender in the legal professions, and her other publications include Legal Cases That Changed Ireland, with some co-editors. She was chairperson of the Oireachtas Vótáil 100 Committee, organising a programme of events in 2018 to mark the centenary of women's suffrage in Ireland, and she was on the executive of the Together for Yes campaign in a successful referendum to repeal the Eighth Amendment in May 2018. We are absolutely delighted to have such a dear friend with us here this evening, and I would ask you that you join me in welcoming her most warmly.
Thank you very much, Luke, for that very kind introduction. I feel I can't live up to the promise of that, but I'll do my best. I must say, when you introduced the Hist and you said the Hist is here to provoke discourse, I thought you were going to say provoke discord, which would be something entirely different. But there has been plenty of discord at many of the debates I've been at, but always respectful, I must say that, and always worthwhile. And some of the most important issues of the day have been debated here in this chamber over many years. It's been my privilege and pleasure to have debated here as a student and to have come back here on many occasions since then as a lecturer and as a senator to debate on pressing issues, and always in that respectful atmosphere of promotion of discourse, not discord. The Taoiseach at one of the events this week spoke about the Hist bringing together dreamers and realists, which I thought was a nice phrase. And we also heard from so many other speakers about how that merging of dreams and realism can be brought together through what President Michael D. Higgins on Monday night called the performance of debate, the performative nature of debate and of this sort of public discourse. So I think we're going to see more of the dreamers and realists' visions and ideas being brought to bear this evening in what promises to be a really stimulating double whammy of a debate. We're going to start first with a discussion, as you know, on the future of capitalism. But I should say that the entire evening is under the umbrella of the challenges facing sustainable development, and we'll be looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals as one of the backdrops. So we're going to start first with this first session with two really distinguished speakers, and we're very lucky indeed to have them here with us. And I should say all of our speakers, I think, have travelled to be here tonight. So we're very lucky that coronavirus didn't stop them travelling, and that we have the pleasure of their company and their expertise. So I'll introduce our two first speakers on the topic of the future of capitalism, and we will then, after they have both spoken, we'll have a little time for Q&A from the floor. We'll then take a short 5 or 10 minute break, and we'll then move on to our second topic, our second panel of the evening, on climate justice and solidarity. And just to say, you should all have the brochures in front of you. The first two speakers, just to introduce them, are Sir Paul Collier and Dr Jennifer Sheehy Skeffington. And then the further two speakers are Professor Mary Robinson and Kumi Naidu. And we're really very lucky to have you all here. So to give you some information about Sir Paul Collier, our first speaker, he is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University and a Director of the International Growth Centre and the ESRC Research Network Social Macroeconomics. His research covers the transformation from poverty to prosperity. Feels like we've had a lot of those transformations in Ireland in recent years. State fragility, the implications of group psychology for development, migration and refugees, urbanisation and the crisis in modern capitalism, which is the subject of his most recent book, The Future of Capitalism. He received a Knighted in 2014 for services to promoting research and policy change in Africa and has been listed as one of the 100 most influential speakers. So I'll ask Paul to speak first and I'll then introduce our second speaker, Dr Jennifer Sheehy Skeffington from the London School of Economics. Paul.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's an honour to be here. The future of capitalism. We've had about 10,000 years of human civilization, and in all that time, we've only discovered one system that's capable of raising mass living standards to prosperity, and that's capitalism. I won't go through the details of why I think it's the only system that's worked so far, and it does work, but not always. And it certainly doesn't work on autopilot. And so periodically, if you leave it on autopilot, it derails. In the 250 years or so that we've had stuff that's broadly capitalist, it's derailed at least 3 times in a big way. The second time you all know about, 1930s, mass unemployment. The third time is what we're living in now, which started around 1980. And I'm going to briefly tell you about the first time it derailed, because that's something that fewer people know about, and it has a few insights. So capitalism got going, actually literally 10 miles from where I was born. I was born in Sheffield, town in the north of England, and 10 miles from where I was born is Crompton Mill, which is now a World Heritage Centre, because it was the first thing that you can call a factory on Earth. Right? So that's why it's a World Heritage Centre. It's the first. Right? Crompton Mill brought people together. They became much more productive in a mill than they were working individually at looms. And then the next big step up was not to just bring people together in a mill, but to put the mills together in a town. And so I'm now going to take you to the most rapidly growing city in Europe by the 1840s. This was Boomtown, and it's Bradford. Yeah? So this was the fastest growing city in Europe. Yeah? It's actually where my German grandfather migrated to from his village in Germany. And so we're going to take you to Bradford in the 1840s, where all these mills were there. It was making people very much more productive than they were just on their farms, because you got the benefits of the scale economies of a mill and the cluster economies of all the mills being together. But by the 1840s, Bradford was about as close as we got outside conditions of war to hell on earth. Because although people were productive, the city was unlivable, because you herded people together and there was no public policy. And so I'm going to take you not just to Bradford in the 1840s, I want to take you there in 1849. And 1849, Bradford is run by Mr. Big. Mr. Big, Titus Salt, owns most of the mills. Right? So he's the local billionaire, he's the local member of parliament, and he's the local MP, mayor. So he's the MP, the mayor, and he owns most of the factories. This is Mr. Big, right? Capitalism, big time, right? And it's 1849, and he's the mayor, and what happens in 1849 in Bradford? Cholera. Why? Because people are herded together, right? Nobody at the time knows what causes cholera. But he is in charge. There's no way out. His workers are dying. His citizens are dying. He is in charge. The buck won't go anywhere else. And it seems to have seared his soul because Titus Salt became the first industrial philanthropist big time. He'd made a fortune, he gave it all away. And what did he do with it? Well, first, he recognized he'd got obligations to his workers. Huh? He didn't know what was causing cholera, but he could see that their living conditions were lousy. And so he built the first purpose-built industrial town on earth. He was Titus Salt. He built Saltaire. Saltaire was the first, and so, sure enough, it's also a World Heritage Centre. Right? And then the rest of his fortune he gave to the citizens of Bradford to clean it up, parks and that sort of thing. When he died, he was hugely loved and respected. He had a vast funeral. There's a vast statue. If you actually go to Bradford and talk to people, they still remember him fondly as he's the local hero. Right? Now we're going to move just a few miles away from Bradford, and we're going to stay in the 1840s. And we're going to go to another northern town, equally ghastly. It's called Rochdale. Does anybody know what happened in Rochdale in the 1840s? The birth of the Rochdale pioneers, the birth of what became the global cooperative movement. Right? A couple of years ago, I was immensely proud to be given a citizenship, a Belgian citizenship award by the Belgian cooperative movement, which is huge. It runs the Belgian health service. And I said, well, how did you get started? And he said, a team came over from Rochdale to Ghent and taught us what to do. Right? So that's Rochdale. If we go a few miles from Rochdale and Bradford, we get to another town, Halifax. Huh? Halifax? What happened there? Building Society. Halifax Building Society? In each case, these were very practical anxieties generated by capitalism. In Bradford's case, it had been health. And Titus Salt responded as the best he could. Right? He recognized his obligations to his workforce and his citizens. In Rochdale, families were facing crisis, and they realized that by building obligations against each other, mutuality, they could address, in very practical terms, those anxieties. I'll tell you one of the anxieties. Health collapsed so badly in the northern cities that life expectancy, the average life expectancy if you were born in a northern city in the 1840s was 19. On average, you were dead at 19. Right? So it's a collapse in life expectancy. So one of the very practical anxieties, if you were poor and dead, or about to be dead, will I get a funeral? And so guess what? The cooperative movement became the biggest funeral director in the country. Very practical anxieties. Halifax, what was it about? Where am I going to live? And so again, a cooperative building society, you pool your savings and that gives you the right to borrow, right? Very practical mutuality of obligations. Right? That was then the 1840s, right? And now I'm going to flip to the 1980s. Right? So the common structure in both business and families in the 1840s had been mutuality. And the genius of that was the same mechanism which produced rights, produced the obligations to meet the rights. That's the genius of mutuality. And then in the 1980s, we get two new symptoms of a new derailment. Derailed 3 times, big time. Each time it's a different problem. The 1930s, mass unemployment, completely different from the 1840s. The 1980s, it's not mass unemployment. What is it? It's two new divergences, social divergences. And one is spatial. For 200 years, up to 1980, poorer regions had been converging on richer regions. The spatial gaps were narrowing. And from 1980 onwards, the spatial gaps between successful regions and broken regions have widened. There are a couple of economic reasons for that, the most obvious of which is globalization. I grew up in Sheffield. You all know what happened in Sheffield, at least all those of you who watched the film The Full Monty. You've just forgotten that that was Sheffield. Right? That was my relatives. Right? That was my relatives. Right? I got out, but I was the only one that did. Both my parents had left school when they were 12, and the rest of my family was in, a tragic situation. What happened to Sheffield was an implosion of a cluster of skill. So the cluster of skill was steel, specialist steel, and the industry shifted to East Asia, to South Korea. A combination of globalization and very poor macroeconomic management, right, that caused that. So that was an example of the new spatial divergence. Successful regions booming and some provincial cities breaking and collapsing. The other divergence was not spatial, it was the new class divide. When I grew up as a kid, Britain had a very clear class divide. It was basically, who were your parents, as it were. And it isn't now. The new class divide is education. It's about people who got a good tertiary education, coming to a university like this, on the back of which they then built specialist skills which became more and more valuable. And so the people with the decent education, decent tertiary education, got themselves on an up escalator. And the people who hadn't had a decent tertiary education, what had they done? Well, they'd invested in manual skills. And those manual skills started to become less and less valuable. The technical economic reason for that is not very interesting, but it's basically the rising complexity. That was the price we pay for rising productivity. And the price we pay for complexity is you need more skill, you need specialist skills, and that privileges the well-educated, but destroys the old manual skills. So you've got a spatial divergence and a new educational divergence, and they're intertwined, they're correlated. Because if you're a bright kid who gets an education in the provinces, what do? You get out. Like I did. You go to the metropolis. And the metropolis booms because it's this cluster of skill which makes people hugely productive. So those are the new divergences. The extraordinary thing is that unlike the 1840s and unlike the 1930s, these divergences just kept getting wider and wider for 40 years. Nothing was done. Because the divergences got wider and wider for 40 years, it was fairly obvious what was going to happen. You were going to get mutinies. The process I've described, I've applied to Britain, but it actually happened all over the place, all over Europe and North America. Right? Mutinies. Mutinies of the less educated provincials against the highly educated metropoles. Right? In Britain's case, what was the mutiny? It was Brexit. That was their chance to rebel. Right? It wasn't really a rebellion against Brussels. It was a rebellion against London. Right? It was a mutiny. Right? Very understandable in the circumstances. Right? Like all mutinies, it wasn't a strategy for a good future. It was angry frustration at neglect. I remember giving this lecture in the north of England. I did a lecture tour. And I said, you suffered from neglect. And I remember a guy at the back standing up, trembling with anger, and saying, we weren't neglected, we've been abandoned. And that's how they felt. Right? Now, as I say, like all mutinies, it doesn't come with solutions, it's just an expression of anger. The most famous mutiny in the world, mutiny on the Bounty, right? Why did they mutiny? Because there was only so much drinking water, and the captain, Bligh, was using the drinking water to keep the plants alive. And it was going through the tropics, and it was rather hot. And eventually the sailors seemed to get a bit fed up that the priority was the plants and not them. And, to be honest, if I'd been a sailor, maybe I'd have felt a bit angry as well, right? So the mutiny wasn't unreasonable, but it wasn't a forward-looking strategy. They didn't say, let's end up on Pitcairn, a little island in the middle of nowhere, right? But that's what happened, and maybe that's what's just happened now. Right? I don't know, just a little island in the middle of nowhere. But we shouldn't judge the mutiny by its consequence. We should judge the mutiny by the fact that it was fully justified by that prolonged neglect. Right? So the question then is, why was there 40 years of nothing being done about it? Right? And that 40 years divided pretty equally between governments of the right and governments of the left. So it wasn't anything to do with right versus left. They both neglected it. Right? That is an inconvenient truth, right? So why? What was going on? And I think the answer is there were some very bad ideas that came in, some on the right and some on the left. But both of these ideas, bad ideas, were basically narratives that justified neglect. Yeah? So if we turn to the narratives of the right, these were my own profession that was really guilty, economics. It was narratives of economic man and market fundamentalism. And this was the notion that the market worked very well to reap all possible benefits, and so all you needed to do was self-interest was perfectly consistent with mutual benefit, because the market delivered that. This is the market fundamentalism. And so it was perfectly all right to be purely self-interested, and that came out eventually as greed is good. Why was greed good? Because the more you drove to maximize your own interest, the more efficient the market became, so the more everybody's boats went up, right? And so the Friedman, the sort of the grand guru of all this, 1970 put out the proposition, the sole purpose of the firm is to maximize profits. And that then filtered through business schools that taught this. Do you know they still do? And by then, by the 90s, that filtered into chief executive officers. When I grew up in Sheffield, the most admired society and the most admired company in Britain was ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries. Right? And its mission statement, year after year, was, it started with saying, the chemical industry is really important for society because of the following reasons, perfectly sensible reasons why chemical industry really mattered. And then it said, our purpose is to become the best chemical company in the world. Right? And so young people like me, do you want to work for this company? Yes. Right? It's a good purpose. The last time that appeared in ICI's mission statement was 1991. By 1994, there was a new mission statement which said, our purpose is to maximize shareholder value. Huh? Does anybody ever, anywhere, get up in the morning and go to work saying, today I'm going to maximize shareholder value? Huh? ICI doesn't exist anymore because in maximizing shareholder value and totally demotivating its staff, it got taken over. Right? I gave this speech in Pakistan a couple of years ago, and the speaker's nightmare happened. So at the end of the talk, it was for the Central Bank of Pakistan, an old guy came up to me and said, I used to be a senior manager in ICI. So I started to say, I don't really know. And he said, he held out his hand, he said, I just want to shake your hand because I saw ICI being destroyed by exactly that. Okay, so those were the stupid ideas on the right. And now let's turn to the stupid ideas on the left, which some of you won't like, but they were equally bad. Right? I'm an equal opportunity insulter. And this came from, again, it wafted over from America, and there were two strands to it. One was a libertarian strand, and the other was a Rawlsian rights strand, human rights. And what both of these did was detach rights from obligations. In fact, in the Rawlsian and libertarian world, there were only two types of actor in society. There was individuals who had rights, and the state, which had obligations. Now, in the community, I'm a communitarian, and in the communitarian world I described that emerged as the solution to the first derailment of capitalism, what were the organizations? There was business, Salt, Titus Salt, who recognized there were obligations. And that produced a cascade of other firms like Cadbury's, which did that same thing, John Lewis and that sort of thing. There was a sense of business as having purpose beyond profit. The purpose of business is to find profitable solutions to people's problems. It's good to find profitable solutions because then they're sustainable. But they're there to solve people's problems. That's the purpose of business. And that got lost. Families, and families in communities, that was cooperative movement. Matching obligations one to another that created rights. That was then, but now we've got this separation of rights are what individuals demand, and obligations pass up to the state. And there's no other actors in this world. There aren't families, there aren't firms, there aren't communities. And the state ends up completely overloaded with obligations that it can't meet. And then we get a more and more, and the battleground in politics becomes, do we privilege individuals, which is the libertarian agenda, or do we privilege the state, which is the strong state of the left agenda? And they are completely antagonistic. But in the 1840s, we had a communitarianism which actually was able to match purposes of business with purposes of families and communities. I don't want to pretend that that was in any way a perfect society. The 1840s were ghastly, right? But it was so ghastly that it sowed the seeds of a viable solution. Communities with obligations that match their rights. Right? So we've derailed, because of these two processes, bad ideas on the right. The market works perfectly, just maximize self-interest. Bad ideas on the left. I've got rights. And how are they met? By the state. Right? That's, I'm going to close in a minute. It doesn't have to be like that. These two divergences, the spatial divergence and the new class divergence, can be reversed. There are perfectly feasible ways of addressing them. They're no harder than the mass unemployment of the 30s or the health crisis of the 1840s, both of which were addressed quite fast. Right? They're no harder. And in my book, The Future of Capitalism, half the book is explaining how you can fix them. I'm happy to take those in questions, but for the moment, I just wanted to leave you with the problem we've got and why we've got it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and you've certainly left us many intriguing questions there. I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, Dr Jennifer Sheehy Skeffington, who's the Assistant Professor of Social Psychology at the London School of Economics, did her undergrad degree here in Trinity and a Master's in Social Psychology at the LSE, was a civil servant, was in the civil service as a social psychologist, I should say, for some time in Britain, and then completed her PhD in psychology at Harvard University in the US, where she was also a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. She joined the LSE in 2016, and we've just been talking about what a great institution that is and how much interesting research goes on there. Her research currently investigates the psychological impact of experiencing low socioeconomic status at times of rising inequality. So it's very close to the sort of topics we've just heard about. And she's also working on poverty alleviation in domestic and international domains and working with the UN Development Programme, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others. So looking forward to hearing Jennifer on the future of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real honour to be able to be here as part of these celebrations and to be able to feature us on a panel with such distinguished speakers. It isn't often that psychologists get called on to speak on the future of capitalism, so of course I wasn't going to miss the opportunity to do that either. However, in doing so, I do feel a sense of responsibility for the discipline, and so I'm not going to talk specifically about my research or cling too much to what specifically Paul has said there. I'm just going to try to pitch out a stall for the relevance of psychology, a particular kind of psychology, to some of the crises we're facing at the intersection of politics and economics. And I'll do so by making a nod in places to some of the things Paul has said and has said in other places. Now, why do I think psychology is important? Well, I think any time that you see a group of people behaving in what seems to be a really irrational or totally amoral way, rather than dismiss that group, it's different if it's an individual, but you cannot dismiss an entire group as being somehow evil or as being somehow mad. You need psychology, and I think in particular you need a social or a societal psychology. Anytime a public policy is meeting some kind of behavioural barrier where there's a lack of understanding of why it is that people aren't taking up policies that we expect them to, or benefits that we expect them to, I think we also need psychologists. Anytime a big ideological agenda, just going to see if this gets me some more time. Yeah. anytime a big ideological agenda seems to fail and all the myths that we thought were guiding us right through the 20th and into the 21st century seem to have been false, I again think we might do with some help from psychology. Now, there's two kinds of approaches you can take there. You can take what's called a behavioral science or behavioral insights approach. Some of you might be aware of that. What you do there is you look at decision-making in a number of different domains and you document systematically how it falls short from the kinds of rational actor assumptions that classical economists would have expected. I think Paul would be on board with me in terms of the importance of that. But the other is, and a lot of my colleagues at the LSE, we have a Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science, so a lot of my very esteemed colleagues are doing that. I'm a different kind of psychologist, which is one that focuses on looking at the underlying processes or mechanisms in the mind as a way of figuring out how we got at the society we have and the ways in which the society we have might affect us. But in particular, in trying to look at those processes and mechanisms in terms of why they might be there in the first place, right? So to do so, that means you need to do a couple of things. But most importantly, I think you need to start thinking about where we came from. You need to think about our brains as evolved. Now, already this is quite controversial because A, the reason psychologists don't get invited to these events is because we don't want to individualize social issues. We're talking about the future of capitalism. We don't want to put it down to individual behavior, but we certainly don't want to do so by talking about evolution or biology, because of course that just leads to legitimizing of the status quo and biological determinism. I hope to convince you that that isn't necessarily the case, and that in fact, and only by looking at the fundamentally social nature and political nature of humans can we understand how this interface between individuals and society helps us understand what society might be doing to us, what capitalism might be doing to us, and speak to the feasibility maybe of some proposed reforms. Of course, I only get 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to do this in quite a stylized way. What I thought I would do is just talk about two aspects of our universal human nature that are relevant, and then, if I have time, touch on how we might understand individual differences, ways in which people differ, as opposed to ways in which we're the same. So the first is our sociality, right? So we're an intensely social species. Even our nearest primate relatives band together in groups. Infants, before they can even speak, can recognize and understand the dynamics of social groups. And as we grow up, even the notion of what the self is only defined through social interaction and the social context. And importantly, all throughout life, our social identities are an important source of self-worth and of well-being. Now, what that means is some of the stuff is quite well known. For example, that we will behave in line with how others in our group are behaving, and the influences of social norms, and we might try to punish those who deviate from our social groups. But also that because we see the world in terms of groups, we're very quickly able to think about things in terms of us and them. And we're very ready to messaging that makes us think about the world in terms of us and them. And you can very quickly see the consequences of this in terms of scapegoating out-group members for some of the consequences of economic strain. I think, Paul, you've discussed this in terms of exclusive nationalism. Also within those kinds of political movements that do that, one will be particularly successful at leading or gaining traction for that if you're able to present yourself as an entrepreneur of social identity, by which I mean as some kind of representative of the people, a representative of my identity group, especially in the case of populism, where the identity group is the people, and regardless of how disingenuous that might be, right? See Donald Trump as a case in point. If you can play the rhetoric in the right way to speak to people's group psychology, it's amazing what you can achieve. Another perhaps more optimistic aspect of group psychology is that what it offers us is a notion of a shared identity, and a shared identity can mean wonderful things for those within the group. It's what underpins solidarity, what underpins willingness for people to invest in collective goods and to help out those who are worse off in the group. Paul has also talked about the importance of this in his work, in particular shared identity at the national level, and that's where the notion of inclusive nationalism comes in as opposed to exclusive nationalism. All that's very nice, and all of those positive things that happen within the group, of course, the flip side of that is that they are rarely extended beyond the group. And so it's a kind of parochial form of solidarity, what results. And that's a big challenge for thinking about not only economic issues, climate change issues, how can we overcome and kind of engage with the fact that we are all kind of fundamentally quite parochial. How can we play with the notion of what our identity is and who we are? I think even Peter Singer has discussed that, for example, in the context of thinking about it at the global scale. But I think this is important because what seem to be very parochial concerns, such as that our group should get more and that other groups shouldn't get it, are actually just the flip side of caring a lot about members of our group, right? So it's not that any, and I really believe this, it's not that any political ideology has the nice guys and the others have the nasty guys. It's not that populism is in some way, or even right-wing populism is particularly hostile. Actually, and if you kind of take time to listen to, for example, Leave voters or voters for Trump, you see a lot of positive regard for other members of the group and real attempts to kind of bring back a sense of solidarity and cooperation that there was at the collective level. That's been lost due to some of the big economic changes that Paul has touched on, in particular the spatial change, the distinction between rural communities and urban communities. So, of course, in saying this, I don't mean to say, okay, so now we're all these group beings and we're stuck with this parochial nature. This is the starting point for thinking what we can do with it, right? Because certainly this aspect of group psychology is very malleable, right? We know that it responds to economic conditions. It responds to macroeconomic conditions. For example, in a recession, we know that people are more likely to become more interdependent and turn to others. Also in economic inequality, for example, there's evidence there that breaks down social solidarity, especially at the national level, but also maybe at lower scales, and that's one of the reasons why it's seen to harm members at all levels of society, not just those at the bottom of society. But also socioeconomic status itself. So within a society, where you sit, that also has interesting effects in terms of your group psychology. But it's hard to be able to talk about that without being able to talk about that other aspect of our shared human nature, which is the importance of social status. So we're groupish, but we're also very hierarchical. Our nearest primate ancestors organize themselves in dominance hierarchies. Infants, before they can speak, can recognize a dominance hierarchy. I can tell you how they do these studies, how we get infants' insights, if you're interested. But in particular, everybody's concerned for status. And there is some very reliable evidence, not just from psychology, that the higher you are in status, the greater well-being you have, and also the more likely you are to behave in ways that enhance your life outcomes, right? To make better decisions. Part of why this is happening is because if you're low in status, what the psychological situation you're in is that you're low in power and you're low in control, right? Being low in relative power, if that also comes with being low in control, that really starts to bother people, because not being in control of your life outcomes is something that fundamentally creates a barrier for being able to make decisions that enhance your life outcomes. If we think about it at the individual level, this is what I've looked at in my research on the psychology of low socioeconomic status. To the extent that you're perceiving yourself as low in status in relation to the rest of society, especially if it's accompanied by other aspects of poverty, such as scarcity in resources and instability, you become very much focused on the here and now. And that means that you're more likely to make decisions in line with the present versus the future, but not in a rational way, or not because of a failure of self-regulation, because that's absolutely rational. That's what the brain should do in response to these kinds of conditions. And if you can't rely on the future, or you can't predict the future, or you feel like you're low in power relative to others. I also think what's happening there is not just a constriction and focus onto the here and now, but also a constriction and focus on the social realm, where one becomes more focused on local social groups and immediate others, and not on society at large. And if that's the case, then it might help us understand some of the paradoxes in the relationship between socioeconomic status and prosociality, where sometimes lower SES groups are described as more aggressive, antisocial, less trusting, and in others as described as more compassionate, caring more about relationships. I think actually it's about who is the relationship with, your local community or family versus representations of the very institutions in society that have marginalized you. Okay, so, also, inequality, again, comes in and interacts with this. The greater inequality, the more status comparisons are salient. This is so, therefore, the more damaging low status is. But again, this has effects all the way up the status hierarchy. The link between inequality and status anxiety is something that's being discussed, and that kind of taking from the lead of people like Wilkinson and Pickett. Psychologists have tried to look at the mechanisms there. But also, I've been inspired by and did my PhD through the context of a theory that actually tried to bring together the psychology of groups with the psychology of hierarchy, to try to understand why it is that in every society that has economic surplus, it seems that things are organized in terms of group-based hierarchies, that some groups have more power and resources and that some groups have fewer. So social dominance theory tries to understand this by looking at forces at the individual, the institutional, the ideological, and the group level. And that was the kind of psychology that I really wanted to try and do. Where it's relevant, again, thinking about political responses to economic change, is in terms of, let's think about the nation as a source of identity. So it implies that every group identity needs to be seen in terms of hierarchy position. And if your group identity, i.e. the nation, is associated with always being on top of hierarchies and always dominating other groups, then nationalism is almost bound to mean a particular thing, to perhaps take an exclusive form. I wonder, and this hasn't been studied, if when members of nations that have traditionally been subordinated or traditionally had a low status, if nationalism there maybe is more bound to take a more inclusive form, or just a more left-wing form, as we see in the case of Scotland, which you're recommending, and perhaps even Ireland. Okay, so, right, so that's it in terms of the universals. How am I doing on time? How much time do I have? 3 or 4 months. Okay, I'm going to go for the individual differences then too. Because it's not the case that everybody's the same. Some people care more or less about groups, and some people care more or less about inequality. I've studied the inequality one quite a lot, egalitarianism, anti-egalitarianism. It turns out that predicts a whole load of political attitudes. It also even shapes the very perception of inequality. So if you're an egalitarian, you actually see more inequality in the world. We've done this with kind of classic visual cognition studies, for example. But what we're trying to do, and this is in work with Lotte Thompson at the University of Oslo, is to try to encourage political scientists to see policy attitudes in terms of their underlying relational preferences. And what that might mean is that it's not the case that anti-egalitarians are just these nasty people who like inequality and want to dominate, and that egalitarians are these nice people who want to help, but that each of them have different senses of what is appropriate to apply to the societal level, of the very basic relational modes that we learn in the interpersonal context, right? So there's a theory called relational models theory. This is actually from anthropology, which says that there are 4 different ways that people can relate to each other interpersonally. One of them is actually equality, right? It's this, and that's how you would relate to peers. This sense that, okay, we need to have balance, that if I contribute something, you need to contribute something, the importance of reciprocity, and of turn-taking. Now, what we think is going on is that egalitarians are the ones who think that this relationship of equality at the interpersonal level is the appropriate one to apply at the societal level. That how we relate to each other as groups in society should be one of equals. And if that's the case, then you would support something like universal basic income. You would think that everybody should have equal outcomes. And or maybe the importance of reciprocity and obligation comes in there. Anti-egalitarians, on the other hand, would prefer to apply another relational model, that of hierarchy, which in interpersonal contexts can be quite legitimate, for example, teacher-student, even parent-child, and the notion that there should be some people should get more or should get more say than others. How that plays out in the societal level is to say some groups have greater rights or should have greater preference or greater say in how societal resources get distributed. And they are claims, being made by groups, in particular the importance of nationality and accessing services such as the NHS. And this notion of the boundedness of the benefits of the nation state is also something, Paul, I think that you've discussed. The other 2, what are they? One is the more basic one of communality. That's actually the one that emerges in the family, right? So you're a shared group, you all share resources, nobody's counting anything. Whoever needs something gets it, and whatever can give, gives it. You can imagine how this applies at the societal level. So to each according to what he needs, from each according to what he can give. But also, if you think about this at the pan-group level, it means that we're thinking about all groups coming together as one, this kind of notion of union, which is perhaps something that we just think about when we think about global challenges such as climate change. The 4th is proportionality. We're calling proportionality. Alan Fisk, who founded the theory, calls it market pricing. It's a lot more transactional. It's when you relate to others in terms of some third currency, effectively. So it's kind of the relationship you enter with a shopkeeper. And the reason I think it matters at the societal level is because it enables the precise quantification of what somebody has contributed and what they should get out. So if you apply proportionality at the societal level, that means that you really think the notion of deservingness matters in terms of who gets what from the welfare state, and in particular, how much someone has contributed, right? So if you think of a social insurance model, it's very much based on your contributions. That's a classic one. But I think broadly, just the notion of equity and deservingness really fits in here. And the fact that we only have measures of anti-egalitarianism that pit equality against hierarchy means that we don't allow, actually, we can't even measure preferences for this kind of equity, which is actually one of the reasons I think you get this kind of demonizing of right-wing ideology in political psychology in my own field. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, I think I think perhaps this shift between, or this kind of going back and forth and this intense polarization, let's say, between what you've called socialism and exclusive nationalism, is this only allowing for considering equality and hierarchy, and that if we open up proportionality, of course, we open up the potential to think about maybe the right way to think about redistribution. I know you've thought about that in terms of deserving versus undeserving wealth, in terms of taxing people who, taxing enterprise and innovation versus taxing just rent seeking. But also, I think we need to think about the communal side of things, because that really brings back the relational dimension and helps us think about ourselves as a society and as a collective and communities and the role that people and relationships can play, which is also something I think you speak to in terms of the importance of the family. Okay, so going back up to the big picture, often what happens when people try to understand things like populism or contemporary crises is that there's a pitting of the economic against the cultural, right? Is it because of people's economic situation, or is it this weird cultural stuff? I think what people mean by the cultural stuff is psychological, and if that's the case, they shouldn't be pitted against each other. In fact, the economic works through the psychological, because psychology really cares a lot about politics and economics. I hope I've convinced you a little bit of that. Also, that it's not helpful to think about good versus bad ideas or ideologies. We're all just relational beings seeking out the right ways to apply these relational models to complex social arrangements that are very different to the environments in which we evolved. And we do so with a lot of moral sentiment, so there is morality on all sides. Also, I think when I think about this kind of psychology, it helps me understand why some of the utopias and the utopian projects of the 20th and maybe the 21st century have failed. I think all utopias will fail to the extent that we don't consider human nature and human psychology, and perhaps some kind of pragmatic reforms and pragmatic solutions can succeed if they also take that into account. Let's see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And it's fascinating to hear that discourse between social psychology and economics, and the way in which the two disciplines clearly interrelate to each other. We're running a little over time, but I might just take a round of comments or questions, just one round, if any of you have particular comments or questions you want to raise, and then I'll come back and just ask each of our speakers to give a very brief 1 or 2 minutes response if you can, because I know we want to move on to the next section of the evening. So, any questions or comments, and could you just introduce yourself? Yes.
Hello, good evening. I'm just a graduate from Italy, but based at UCD, currently teaching assistant there. And I have a question for Professor Collier. My research specializes on a phase in the history of capitalism. This is rather different from the one we're going through right now. It's not an automated one, and it was actually quite guided one. And it is the one you were describing when you were referring to the kind of the entrepreneurial philosophy of the ICI. And it was described in a book which was published 55 years ago called Modern Capitalism. And my question for you is, so what do you think the value today of studying that one world of sectorial planning, technocratic management, and corporatist interest representation? And what is the place of that world in the future of capitalism? Do you see a return to that institutional setting? And if yes, why? Thank you.
Okay. Right. You had yes, yourself, and then yeah.
So I'm actually a PhD based here in Unity, and also part-time work on a second job. So I also have a question for Professor Collier, and because I actually was aware of actually also involved in Davos 2020, so I actually want to ask that, do you think there has been any concrete changes in company conduct and focus in the last 2 years? And the other question of mine is that, do you think is model of stakeholder capitalism put forward by facing any real change, or is it just a lip service?
Oh, thank you. Okay, yourself?
I'm Alan. I have a question for Dr. Jennifer Sheehy, and it's regarding proportionality and quantifying contribution to society. And I was wondering, is it possible to
quite a number of other hands, so I might just take two more comments, and then I know you won't be able to answer in a few minutes, but just to give a quick observation, yourself and then yourself, and then we'll come back.
Ted Smith, I'm a very ancient member of the Hist, and because of that, Sir Paul, I'd like you to give a hint as to your answer before I die, what the future of capitalism is going to do about it. More urgent by the day.
I feel like that should almost be the last question, but I know there was another hand up here. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Hi, my name is Kathy. I'm a Christian doctor with the Open University. I want to link with both your talks. I spent my life listening to people's stories and they told me their dreams. And the main problem I come across time and time again is very high achieving people, if they had a humble start in life, have a very poor sense of self-worth. I'm a postman. In fact, I've got first in maths and stats. I can't possibly apply for a past civil service. So my question to both of you is thinking about the future of capitalism and thinking about this widening gap. What can we do to engender a sense of increased self-worth so people can reach their potential and our society can reach its potential?
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. We're going to give you the last word from the floor, I think, because we're short on time. I might ask Jennifer first and then Paul. Just a very brief response, if you can. And those were excellent questions. I know we can't cover everything asked.
I perhaps will cheekily use this as an opportunity to make a point that I didn't get to make, which was just that given that we're such relational beings who are so sensitive to hierarchy, I think perhaps as well as considering these pragmatic reforms, maybe we need to think in a more systemic way about the ways structuring society in a way that enhances those forecloses the realisation of the potential of ourselves as more kind of collective and solidaric beings. And so I think precisely that lack of self-worth is an example of how those ways of organising society isn't working, and the more unequal society gets, kind of the more obvious that becomes. So whether proportionality is a solution, I don't actually think it is, precisely for the reasons you were saying. What we find when we measure people's preferences for proportionality at the societal level is actually that they come together with preferences for hierarchy. And they get tied up in that way. I've thought a lot about how do you still maintain solidarity and the sense of obligation without counting it, especially given the negative impacts of welfare conditionality, for example. But it's a big question I'd be happy to talk about.
Okay, Paul?
Thanks. So, I mean, big two. One is, have we got hope? Yes, there's a lot we can do to get business back to a much more normal narrative. I mean, it is ludicrous that business should say our sole purpose is profit. Ludicrous. What does business do? It clothes us, it feeds us, it houses us. It's very positive purposes. And instead of bypassing those purposes and saying we're just about profit, obviously it should be saying our purpose is to solve human needs. Right? We'll do it in a profitable way. Is there hope? Yes. After years of this ridiculous mantra of our purpose to maximize profit, business is rapidly changing. For example, the American Business Forum, which is the top 183 businesses in America, for 30 years was coming out every year with this crap, our sole purpose, maximize shareholder value. In August, they withdrew it. They rescinded it. They said, that's not what we do. Our purpose is to meet the needs of all our stakeholders. And I work with a colleague at Oxford called Colin Mayer, who was the head of the business school at Oxford Professor of Finance. We thought it would take years of criticism to achieve that change. It's already happened. Right? So it's a winnable fight, that one. And there's definite hope. We can also start changing the laws to make it required that businesses come out with a clear purpose and that directors are legally responsible for measuring those purposes. We can do a lot. Right? Then the second question about, a very good question about self-worth. Self-worth of the people who are not going to university. Where's their self-worth? Right? And the answer is that at the moment, we've denigrated these people because the successful people shamefully have peeled off from shared identity with others. And this is part of the denigration of the very people who are most suffering, describing them as bigots, racists, fascists, nationalists. They're not. They're people who used to see themselves as shared membership of the same society, and now the successful have said, who are you? They're nothing to do with you. We believe in all humanity. Well, they don't. They believe in themselves, their own, they believe they deserve their own success, and they don't, right? So one thing we can do is denigrate the people who've peeled off from recognizing they have obligations to others in the society. So that's one thing we can do, is shame the successful who peeled off. And the other thing we can do is start building the real skills of ordinary people. We are terrible in Britain at doing that. If you've got cognitively gifted, Britain is the best place on earth, right? We've got 3 of the top 10 universities in the world. Right? The European Union at the moment has 0 between them. Right? So we're a wonderful place if you're cognitively gifted. Right?
Ooh, that was controversial, I have to say.
But if you're not cognitively gifted, Britain is the worst place in the whole of the OECD. It's perfectly feasible to build the skills of ordinary people. Look at Switzerland. Switzerland has a top 10 university, but 60% of Swiss kids choose not to go to university because there's equally prestigious ways of accumulating skill. You can become the head of a Swiss bank by a non-university route. So that's the hope. Give the rest, the lower half of society, the self-worth by stopping denigrating it, switch the denigration to the people who peeled off, and build skills.
Right, on that note, Paul.
I apologise, I'm a Sheffield boy at heart. Right?
Yes, but Paul, I was tempted to say you're in the EU now. I'd like to thank both our wonderful speakers, Jennifer and Paul, for that really stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. We're just going to take 5 minutes, and for you to stretch your legs, and then we'll be returning with our next wonderful panel, Mary Robinson and Kumi Naidu.
Everybody, just to say that there are some mild refreshments such as tea and coffee next door, but don't let that